The global economy is crashing on a scale we've never seen before. But what will the world look like when the dust finally settles? And will we be better or worse off? I'm Imran Garta, and today on the Newsmakers, we look at the financial ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic. The International Monetary Fund is telling the world to brace for the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The Great Lockdown, as they're calling it, has likely saved millions of lives. But at what cost to financial markets, industries, and of course, individual fortunes? The question for those crunching numbers isn't just when will economies recover, but what's the best way to make that happen? Does it mean throwing money at the problem or tightening belts? Spend or save? Stimulus or austerity? And who ultimately foots the bill? Lots of questions. Here to debate some of those questions is Richard Wolff in Northampton, Massachusetts. He's a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and currently a visiting professor of international affairs at the New School University in New York. And economist Peter Morici joins us from Washington, D.C. He's a professor emeritus of international business at the University of Maryland. Gentlemen, really great to have you both on, especially at the same time. Richard Wolff, a lot of people have a lot of anxiety, right? So if they haven't lost their jobs, they might lose their jobs. Even if they're doing semi-okay right now, they're very worried. There's a lot of trauma related to what comes next. But I wonder, when we look at where we were to begin with, were we more fragile than our global economic system had sort of sold itself as?
Yes, in my opinion, we were. And indeed, that fragility contributed to the lack of preparedness for this virus, the lack of a capacity either by the private sector to produce what we needed to cope with it, nor of the government that thinks the private sector is always the best way to go, so it didn't compensate for the failures of the private sector. You know, it isn't profitable to produce tests and gloves and masks and store them for an eventual pandemic, so private capitalists don't do it, and either the government compensates for them or it doesn't. In the United States, it didn't, and you can see partly why. The last crash a few years ago, 2008, led to the collapse of interest rates, to the pumping of money into the economy. It made every business borrow to solve whatever problem it had, because the money was plentiful and the interest rate was low, making the economy a debt-ridden economy on a scale we hadn't seen before. That was a kind of a symbol of fragility, and now we see the price that is being paid when you run your economy in this way.
Peter Morici, a bad system, and all it therefore took was a virus to completely wreck us. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's not just a virus. I mean, this is not like the 1957-58 influenza epidemic, which killed 100,000 Americans and would be the equivalent of 260,000 today, which is supposed to be the worst case scenario this time around. This thing is far more virulent in terms of the kinds of symptoms it causes, how heavily it taxes the healthcare system, the resources that it requires, and what is required to contain it. In 57-58, a lot of the social distancing was informal. Schools closed, but businesses went on. And by 1960, when Jack Kennedy was running for office, they were talking about a recession, but the virus wasn't much considered much of a factor. This was no ordinary event. This was like this was our modern version of the Black Plague. My feeling is that capitalism always has a certain fragility to it, but that over the last 10 years, the system has not grown enough. There hasn't been enough progress across the board, and that businesses were indeed very fragile, as were state and local governments. Basically, anybody who couldn't print their own money and sell bonds that the world would accept, which are very few governments, are in a fragile situation. Also, like all times, we have a lot of structural change in the economy. The coming of the digital era, the decline of petroleum, the stress on automobile companies, which is such an important source of wealth on mainland Europe, especially in Germany, which drives the European economy, and the Midwest in the United States. all these things were playing out, and they're much easier to deal with in the context of an economy that grows at 3% rather than 2%. Now, people at the left, have a set of solutions. People at the right have a set of solutions. I do agree with Mr. Wolff about the unpreparedness of government. After the SARS epidemic, during the SARS epidemic, we ran down a lot of crucial supplies. One of them are masks that are in the strategic reserve that the federal government keeps. And the Obama people didn't replenish it. When the Trump people came in, they didn't view some kind of healthcare crisis as a particular menace, and they de-escalated their attention to it. I don't know that it would have made any difference if they hadn't in terms of what they bought, but clearly we weren't prepared. But before we're too hard on them, let's face it, it is very, very difficult to foresee what causes these crises. No one has ever really settled on what caused 1929, because it wasn't just the stock market that crashed. The whole bloody economy collapsed, and why that happened. Right. It was very difficult to foresee the financial crisis because people were just doing what they always do, borrow money to buy homes. And now it was very difficult to foresee that a pandemic would strike. We'll have another crisis 10, 20, 30 years from now, and it'll come from yet another space and another cause. But, it is very, very difficult to foresee these things.
Right. Okay. Professor Wolff, there's, talk of the left and the right and the Obama people and the Trump people. Something the Obama people did in response to the last financial crash was to inject money into the economy, bailouts and so on. Now we've seen the Trump people inject trillions into this economy. You could call it bailouts, you can call it whatever you want to, but this idea that the economy needs to be saved and big companies in the stock market need to be saved, is that a sustainable solution in trying to stem the blood flow, if you like?
Well, here's the bizarre thing about it. It's a solution that only worsens the underlying difficulty and thereby prepares the way for the next crisis. Look, we are now in the third crisis of capitalism in this new century. We had the dot-com crisis in 2000, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and now the coronavirus crisis. We like to name the crises after what triggers them rather than naming them as they should be named, as recurrent business cycle crashes. And solving the problem after the dot-com by throwing money and cutting interest rates, doing the same after the 2008, and now doing the same, ought to at least begin to lead people to ask, what is going on with a system that has always crashed every 4 to 7 years? This is now the third one in the first 20 years, another 7-year average being reproduced. This system's instability is the fundamental problem, just like its promotion of inequality is a fundamental problem. Sooner or later, the system itself has to come into question. And if I could say one thing about Professor Morici's comment, I like that he brought up the Black Plague. The Black Plague was the beginning of the end for feudalism in Europe. And this plague may in fact play the same role for capitalism in our time.
Peter Morici, is this the end of capitalism? Is this going to be the straw that breaks the capitalist camel's back?
I doubt it, because the alternatives that are available that would be better are not apparent. I mean, state socialism failed in Eastern Europe in the second half of the 20th century terribly badly. Central planning doesn't work very well in terms of dealing with the potential for rapid technological change to solve our problems of a very large population. What the Chinese offer the world, if that's what Mr. Wolff is suggesting, is not particularly attractive to me. I think that civil liberties are worth something. If you look at the kinds of things going on in China right now, rounding up Africans, squelching dissent in Hong Kong and so forth, the wholesale jackboot treatment of any aspirations for democratic liberty, the kind of social controls and social credit system they have to contain their population and enforce ideological purity. I'm not seeing what alternatives there are. We have functioned in some form of capitalism throughout most of history. The Roman Empire was a capitalist system. Feudalism in some way was, it's just a matter of who controls the capital. My feeling is that we have sort of been bamboozled by the financiers in a lot of ways. A lot of our troubles do go back to the fact that there's so many more, for example, derivatives than the world really needs. Derivatives go back to the ancient Greeks. Greek farmers would basically buy insurance on their crops in case they got hail, or buy insurance on the price they could sell for so they were assured of not going bankrupt. There's nothing wrong with that. However, when people start buying derivatives and selling derivatives when they're not engaged in the real market, they're just basically betting on the event, you're asking for trouble, and that's what goes on. If you decide that you're going to regulate the way banks give mortgages, we can talk about how much regulation is needed, how stringent it should be. But then if we just let the letting of mortgages go outside the banking system to an alternative group, you're creating yet even more instability.
Okay.
So things of that nature.
Okay, so
I don't know that the system is being well run.
Okay, so you're asking a lot of questions about what's the alternative, right? So, Professor Wolff, say we all agree that there's a lot of inequality and the system is broken. Those who argue in favor of capitalism say, well, it generates capital, it has immense creative potential. Any other alternative that has been tried doesn't generate capital and involves taking money from people who have and giving it to people who don't have, which involves a system of oppression, which invariably leads to a form of totalitarianism. Address that for us in the context of a post-COVID world.
Okay, there are two ways to go in doing this. Putting aside the caricatures of either side, let's understand something. I have criticisms of virtually every system, my own, the Chinese, the Russian, the French, it doesn't matter. I want to recognize, however, when economic development is the goal, to go from poor to rich, what works? And the Chinese economy is the outstanding performer of the last 30 years. We want to get from 2 to 3% per year. Their growth is 3 times that and has been for 25 years. They've answered the question, what system grows faster? And they've done it with modern technology, with accumulating capital, and any other major measure, growth of GDP, you name it. I don't like things that go on there. That's another matter. But if your goal is to grow from poor to rich, we have an alternative to the private capitalism of the West. We have a kind of state-run capitalism in the East, and you can dance around it all you want. That's a reality. Second, what's the alternative now? Well, let me just pick one. We now have roughly 35 million people in the United States unemployed. That's crazy. That is an inefficiency of capitalism. Private employers, the overwhelming bulk, fired those people. They did it because that's the profitable thing to do. Cut your losses, minimize your risk. So they fired them. And now what we have sitting there, getting depressed, getting angry, getting upset, locked down to boot, so it's even more difficult. What could we do? It's obvious. We could do now what was done in the 1930s. Hire them, rehire them. That's what the government is for. Put them to work. And you know what we need them for? Less than 2% of Americans have been tested for the coronavirus as I speak. The other 98% haven't. Here's a job for the unemployed. Hire them to do the testing. That would enable us to know who's without the virus and could reopen the economy, rather than doing what you are doing now, which is telling people, here's your choice. You lose your income, you lose your job, you may even lose your unemployment benefits, or you can go back to work and take the risk of infecting yourself and your family. That's a failure of one system when the alternative is obvious.
Pretty interesting philosophy there and option for reemployment there. Peter Morici, 35 million people filed for unemployment. They're out of a job. Until we get a vaccine, things are probably going to be fundamentally changed, even if the infection rate is not very high, right? So how does the system actually accommodate for those people? Because you're not going to see the natural sort of boom to the economy under some form of semi-lockdown with interactions having changed.
Yeah, let me respond to that and a couple of other things that have been said. You know, China's been able to be very successful by preying on capitalist systems that incorrectly thought they could sort of absorb China, and if they did, China would reform and become democratic when it's become even a more totalitarian state. So if that's the option Mr. Wolff wants, I welcome him to go teach there and see how well he likes living there. I don't care to live inside that world. Slavery also can generate a great deal of capital and progress. The antebellum South, Gone with the Wind, was not that far from being wrong in terms of how the upper class lived. If he wants to generate capital by having slavery, I don't think that option is available to him. But certainly the Chinese system is. Many people were laid off simply because the companies didn't have the money to pay them. And not all of the aid has hardly gone to propping up big businesses, as you have characterized. So that's out. And to say this is a failure of capitalism, this is a plague that has come down on mankind. Now, 35 million people is 1 out of every 10 people in the United States. More. I don't think we need them all as testers. The basic problem is we cannot generate enough testing kits fast enough, because that you can't prepare for. You have to know what a virus looks like to be able to have tests. And you don't know what it looks like until it happens. So that's a silly answer. My feeling is that once we can go back to work, and that's not an economic question, that's a healthcare question or a public health question. Because as soon as you reopen economy, you have a situation like Korea has. They stamped out the virus. And then last week, some people congregated in a bar. One guy walked in with the virus, infected 50 people. They went home to their friends and family. And all of a sudden, Korean officials are trying to track down 3,000 people. No matter how good the intentions, social distancing isn't going to keep us from infecting people. So, that's really a healthcare question as to when you reemploy people. But when we do that, I would suggest probably 20 million people will find their old jobs back there.
Okay.
But a lot of firms did fail because they can't handle just going out of business for
Professor
60
Morici,
days or 90 days.
We're running
so we're going to have to find ways to reemploy them.
Okay, I've got to move on now. I just want to give Richard Wolff a final 30 seconds here to wrap us up. If you may, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, telling me where to live, that's a very old game here in the United States. When you can't win an argument, tell someone to leave. Unfortunately, you fire people. Perhaps Professor Morici would like to continue that wonderful tradition of dealing with disagreement in that manner. I talked about China as an economic growth success. He knows that that's true. And that's one of the reasons you have to make up the story that it was private capitalism or that they stole it. Every country on the way down, like the United States capitalism is, has to find the fault in somebody else because they can't cope with their own failures. This is a failure of a system to prepare. To rehire people now, it's not just testing. That was an example and one badly needed. You can also reconfigure workplaces so they are safe. You can produce many of the other things. You can put people to work teaching as tutors in our profession of education so that we don't lose an entire generation. There's lots of things to be done that are needed. It's just this capitalist system can't do it.
Richard Wolff and Peter Morici, I'm the only person in this discussion without a PhD in economics, so it's been really good to listen to you both. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Now, my next guest says the coronavirus pandemic is a political crucible, one that will undoubtedly melt down and reshape the norms and values society currently lives by. But what those norms will look like and what those values will be are questions he's currently grappling with. And he joins me now from his home in Berkeley, California, to discuss them. Good to have you on the program, Jeremy Lent. What's bothering you right now in the midst of the coronavirus crisis?
Well, what I think is coming to my mind the most, especially after hearing this kind of conversation we just heard right now between these two economists, is that people are still not really thinking big enough about the impacts of what we're seeing with the coronavirus. And I really think we need to recognize that the last time we saw something as big as this happening to the world was really the Second World War. And what we're really looking at with the impact of the coronavirus, not the virus itself, but more the impacts as one domino falls after another, is really the end of an era. And it's what I call the end of the neoliberal era. So we're not talking about the end of capitalism, but the end of a particular era that has dominated the last few decades of global economy and thought and basically everything, every part of the human culture. And what we really need to be thinking about is what era comes next and what can we do to actually bring a better life to people.
But before we talk about what comes next, what's on the other side of that door, you could ask 100 people what their definition of neoliberal is or neoliberalism is, and they'd give you 100 different answers. So according to you, tell me how you define it.
Sure, I think it's fairly simple. It's really a fundamentalist market-based approach to the world, saying that everything can be reduced to some kind of market demand with a price to it, even things that most people through history have felt should not be bought and sold. Things to do with human values, things to do with quality of life, things to do with the earth itself. And along with that has been this belief in the individual as the core basis of all values. So community gets kind of thrown out, and everything is based on not just the individual, but this kind of myth of a selfish, rational individual that we rely on in order to make decisions to make the world a more efficient place.
Right.
Those bases of this kind of market fundamentalism and the individual as the sole basis of values, I think have been shown by in evolutionary biology, all kinds of perspectives to be like plain wrong. But it's the myth that the world is based on right now.
Right. So this novel coronavirus comes along and shatters those myths. What then happens as we pick up those pieces? What kind of world should we be preparing to live inside of in the coming years?
Right. Well, I think that there are, at the most extreme, there's kind of two very divergent scenarios we could be looking at. And the reality may be some interconnection of those two. But in what I view as the more troubling scenario, we actually can look at even more of an authoritarian and big corporate power takeover of the economy and our thought processes and basically every part of human life. So we see a more acceptance towards the sort of notion of surveillance state and surveillance capitalism, where it feels like okay for even people to be tracked on their iPhones, everything like that. We also see that some of the potential for some of the biggest corporations becoming even more powerful, for those countries that have given really all the support to the biggest institutions and military sort of shut off of communication between people, all those more negative trends we see as a possibility. There's also the possibility that people around the world, just like Richard Wolff was talking about, are getting angry. And they've already been angry based on these imbalances of neoliberal capitalism, the greatest inequality really in all of history, where just the wealthiest 26 people in the world own as much wealth as half the entire world's population. When those things get to be even more extreme, there's this possibility for a shift towards more humanitarian values and people re-envisioning the whole economy and the whole way in which the world works based on a more humanitarian and human-based approach.
Does it transcend the left and right debates, the capitalism versus socialism and so on?
Yes, I think it does. And I think that many forward progressive thinkers at this time have already left that behind. That's really a 20th century debate. It's not really the debate for the 21st century. And I think that what is very possible is to revision what our actual whole global civilizations should look like. And if we think about it from a bigger picture, you know, coronavirus itself will be past a couple of years from now, but we have much bigger existential crises facing our civilization. Like, for example, the climate breakdown, which is nowhere near to being under control. And even if the world goes on the rate at which countries have committed to reduce their emission growth over the next years, we're still looking for, by the end of the century, massive 3 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures, which many scientists think is not even compatible with civilization. And that's not even looking at the ecological breakdown. So if we can envision a different kind of civilization, some of us are calling it an ecological civilization, one that's based on life-affirming values rather than money-affirming values. And that would lead to a very different kind of breakdown where you could have more regional and community-based organization.
Jeremy, I've got to wrap. It's been really great to talk to you. Hope to chat to you again sometime soon. Thank you very much for joining us here on this episode of The Newsmakers, and thank you for watching. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.